Chapter 6 Narrative Design. No matter the medium, a meaningful and well-told story will always be something that humans can appreciate. When it comes to games, we, as players, participate in the story that a game creates. If we do nothing, the story can't move forward. Our actions, our decisions, and our failures may affect how the story plays out, with varying degrees of subtlety. With enough freedom, the story becomes our own. This chapter will take a look at how games can make the most of their interactivity to tell stories in a compelling and immersive way. Not every game requires a narrative to succeed, but every game designer needs to understand the connections between narrative and gameplay. Storytelling is part of game design. Occurrences during play can feel consequential enough to warrant a substantial emotional response. What we want to do is shape that emotional response in a way that benefits the experience. There are a lot of different approaches we might take, many of which would depend on a specific design context. Our goal is to understand how we can create moments that resonate with players and stick with them even after the adrenaline of gameplay has faded. Ultimately, this comes down to a question of emotional investment. Getting players interested in what's happening inside a game, and more importantly, keeping that interest alive. Making players' actions feel valuable in the moment, and following through on the consequences of those actions. So the question becomes, how do we make players feel? Narrative and characters. How successful a game is at creating and delivering a good story depends on several different things. The obvious answer here is writing quality. Our enjoyment of media can be down to the metal of its writing. An intriguing premise can be ruined by a bad script, and even the simplest of stories can come alive with interesting turns and great dialogue. What we read or watch is defined by its writing. Except players don't experience a game by reading or watching it. They experience a game by playing it. Something that is fun to read or watch isn't necessarily fun to play. While books and film have only the language of the senses available to communicate, games have the language of interaction. This fundamentally changes both how we experience narrative in games and how we design those narratives in the first place. A game story isn't just a layer on top of gameplay, it's something that needs to bleed through in a player's moment-to-moment experience. Otherwise, there may be a conflict between story and gameplay. One of the simplest instances of this discrepancy is when characters are shown to do things in cutscenes that substantially over or understate their abilities when compared to their role in regular gameplay. One of the most irritating consequences of disconnecting story and gameplay, though, is a far more obvious problem requiring no identification or inconsistencies in logic or ideology. To put it simply, cutscenes can be boring sometimes. In games where action is the priority, overly long or frequent cutscenes can feel like interruptions rather than intermissions. If it is best to refrain from relying entirely on the cutscene formula to tell our stories, the question becomes, what are we supposed to do? One of the oldest sayings in creative writing is show, don't tell. Demonstration via showing an event is certainly more effective than just telling the audience about it. However, neither can come close to the engagement resulting from participation in that event yourself by doing. In games, we might say do, don't show. Watching a character die instead of just hearing about it is one way to help raise emotional stakes and memorability. In The Last of Us, players are introduced to the protagonist Joel and his daughter Sarah in the opening moments of gameplay. In a cutscene shortly thereafter, Sarah is killed by gunfire and dies in Joel's arms. Although Joel's story still would have been tragic had we only been told about Sarah's death after the fact, seeing and hearing it happen helps to make this event more memorable. and thus more effective in characterizing Joel as a bereft father. The takeaway here is that deeper levels of interaction may provide greater emotional investment. This notion is far from exclusive to the example of character depth. All storytelling can benefit from richer integration with what players are doing when they play a game. In constructing a narrative, it is our hope as storytellers that our audience will care about the characters we bring to life. To make them relatable, likable, and memorable requires good characterization, the process of developing a character's personality through their past and present actions. A well-developed character is a memorable one. Good characterization, then, is about creating strong memories. The challenge with games in comparison to other media is that our relationships with characters are much more personal. To effectively develop our characters, we should take some inspiration from how we create memories with real people. Our relationships are built on moments, mostly insignificant ones, in fact. Watching someone walk away from an explosion is cool, but it doesn't make you like them or really remember them as a person. Creating truly great characters in games is about orchestrating these little moments. Player agency. One of the many appeals of gaming is the ability to feel in control of your actions. This feeling of control is referred to as agency in the social sciences. Essentially, agency combines the free will to make choices and the power to act on those choices. Games grant us a sense of agency in terms of gameplay pretty much effortlessly. As players, we choose when and where we want to run, shoot, move stuff around, and so on. To grant players agency, games need to fulfill two basic requirements. Players feel like they can make decisions, and players feel like their decisions have consequences. This means players can make meaningful choices about what to do. For instance, in gameplay, players might be able to pick which weapons they'd like to use against a particular boss. In the context of the story, players might be able to choose whether they'd like to obey or disobey the wishes of a certain character. The feeling of free choice can be compromised if players do not feel like multiple viable alternatives are available for a given situation. For instance, players' sense of agency will diminish if routinely faced with ultimatums, or pigeonholed into decisions that prevent one reasonable option amongst others which are clearly ineffective. After a choice has been made, players should feel that their decision was important, and that their actions had a tangible effect on the situation at hand. Ensuring player agency in the context of a game's narrative can be complicated due to various technological and artistic limitations. Furthermore, it may not always be appropriate for players to have agency at every moment in every game. Much of the time, you might be interested in how to maximize a player's perception of their agency, while working within constraints that severely limit your ability to provide decision points that influence the course of the game. Throughout this section, we will explore how agency can be nurtured in a game's narrative and gameplay, balancing player freedom with a designer's creative vision. A player's journey through a game belongs not only to them, but to their character, should they control one. As the player works through any series of decisions during play, they exert their will through their character. To preserve immersion and lend these decisions an increased sense of importance and meaning, players need to be able to relate to, or at least have a deep understanding of, their character. This brings about a challenging design question. How do we develop a compelling protagonist when their actions will ultimately be controlled by someone else? There are two primary approaches to this task. Naturally, not every solution lies neatly in one category or the other. The most games will comfortably rest on one end of the scale created between the two. The goal of silent protagonists is to create a character who is inherently relatable through a lack of definite features. giving players a blank slate on which to project their own motivations and personality. For most games, the real defining quality of a blank slate protagonist is simply their silence. Even in a game with a significant narrative context, silent protagonists can work without disrupting the story. In games where a total lack of dialogue is inappropriate, other characters may remark on the player character's reluctance to speak. Another common choice is to provide some companion characters, which speak for the protagonist in a sense, commenting on the situation and interacting with the player's character. In a game where the main character is primarily a vessel for players to inhabit, companions can help to provide some extra personality and opportunities for dialogue. At the other end of the spectrum is a main character whose personality, backstory, and motivations are fully developed. Characterized protagonists aren't afraid to speak, and often have existing relationships with characters the player is meeting for the first time. However, someone who is compelling and interesting as a character might not be enjoyable as a protagonist. No matter what traits or intricate backstory you ascribe to a protagonist, players will still try to see themselves in that character. Crucially, their motivations need to reasonably align with the motivations of their character. If the protagonist acts for the sake of hitting a particular narrative beat, their choice needs to be one the player would reasonably make. Otherwise, players may become frustrated, feeling that the character they control is no longer in their control, and thus becoming deprived of their agency. This is not to say that characterized protagonists can't have strong personalities or flaws. If your protagonist is prepared to make a decision, you just need to be able to justify it in the player's eyes. Part of the appeal of many games is being able to do whatever you want, no matter how morally dubious. Acting like a complete monster can be fun and provide a harmless outlet. Nonetheless, it may be preferable to enforce some basic sense of right and wrong in games. Moral or legal consequences help to make a virtual world and its inhabitants feel more alive. In games with heavy role-playing elements, a sense of allegiance to the moral code of a particular group or society can be an important part of the immersion. Serious players will often choose their behavior based on their personal understanding of right and wrong, or an understanding of their character's ethics. Nonetheless, reflecting some sense of morality in a game's writing or mechanics can help to reinforce this idea, improve realism, and make less serious players think twice about their actions. Sometimes, these systems sit at the forefront of gameplay, while others rest just below the surface. Many games employ some form of explicit morality or reputation system. Oftentimes, these systems are binary. Thus, a pervasive problem emerges with explicit morality systems in general. They tend to feel like cheap dichotomies. These systems can be fun mechanically. However, they may not exhibit political, ethical, or narrative nuance. Explicit morality systems tend to offer choices that reduce to extremes in keeping with their binary nature. For instance, would you like to extinguish the fire in the village or throw kittens into it? Getting players to seriously consider what they've done can be as simple as foregoing a reputation meter. Internally, that same value can tick away, still an oversimplification, but an easy way to track players' actions and shape the behavior of NPCs accordingly. Without the crutch of an icon to peek at, players will be forced to take their decisions more seriously, perhaps left wondering as to whether they've done the right thing in the eyes of different characters. Sometimes, games present a moral choice without any implication of lasting consequences or definite rewards. From this, we can surmise that a heavy-handed approach is an easy but possibly uninteresting option if you're planning to enforce some form of player morality. While explicit reputation meters have their place in spicing up the gameplay, Encouraging a little bit of gray may make choices feel more engaging. As a final note, it should be reiterated that not all stories players will experience are written by developers. The term emergent gameplay is used to describe play which isn't explicitly planned by designers, and rather emerges from a player's interactions and experimentation with game systems. We can also speak of emergent stories in this regard. For all the months spent on beautifully realized cutscenes, a player's favorite story might be one that comes from their own gameplay. Players don't watch a story alongside a game, they live a story through a game. Whether orchestrated by designers, created through gameplay, or something in between, some of our dearest gaming memories can come from the stories we experience. Thank you for listening. This presentation only covers a small portion of the content in the book. Make sure you check it out for examples of Samantha's quirky writing and narrative design in games. You can scan the QR code here to be taken to the store page. In the book, you will also find an exclusive interview with Osama, lead content designer at Blizzard Entertainment.